Story 1. The Attic That Locked from Outside. I booked it for the quiet more than anything. A week to myself where the only things I'd have to answer to were the kettle and the wind in the trees. So when I pulled up to the heritage cabin and saw cedar siding gone grey with age and quilts folded on the porch rail like flags in truce, I felt that easy release you get when a place looks exactly like the picture in your head. The host had left the keys in the door and a note on the table with the Wi-Fi password and 2 lines of hand-drawn arrows showing where to find extra firewood, plus a small, "Please keep the attic closed" that I read as common sense. Old houses have all kinds of things in their roofs, and I wasn't looking for more company than I brought. The air inside smelled like pine cleaner and something older beneath it, the sweet dust of dry wood baking through 100 summers. I made tea, walked the rooms slow. The place had that curated old-time feel, crockery that had never seen a dishwasher, a braided rug with a faded star in the center, a spinning wheel that was probably never used by anyone but tourists with cameras. Evening settled early because the ridge behind the cabin took the light first, and the quiet that came down with it felt right. I read until I fell asleep on the couch, and sometime deep in the night I woke to a sound overhead, a dull thump, not loud, not close, like something heavy shifting its balance. Old beams, I told myself, house breathing after sunset. I lay there listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock in the kitchen spool out seconds, and when nothing else came, I went back under. The second day was cold, the kind of cold that's crisp rather than mean, sunlight like a blade across frost on the porch rails. I drove into town for eggs and coffee and one of those local history pamphlets that tell you more about church bake sales than about history. And by the time I got back, the ridge had pulled its trick with the light again. I kept the lamps low and the fire soft. That night, the thump returned, the same dull weight. Then again, and a faint dragging, like something being pulled a foot or two across rough wood. I stood in the kitchen with the edge of the counter under my hands and felt the sound through my forearms. The attic stairs were right there, tucked against the back wall beside a narrow pantry. Plain pine steps, climbing to a door with a little brass latch. It was closed, the latch down. When I leaned closer, I could smell cold air sneaking around it, that sweet iron smell old wood carries when it holds night in its cracks. I listened until I felt foolish and went back to the couch. There are animals that get into attics no matter how tidy a place is. There are settlement pops. There are stories you tell yourself to keep your shoulders from creeping up to your ears. The third morning, I noticed the latch had shifted. I couldn't swear it, and yet I could. The angle of it was different, as if someone had set it in place from the outside to secure whatever was behind the door on the inside. Maybe the cleaning person had been through after I left for town, I reasoned. Checking things, making sure the guests didn't toss their cigarette butts in the crawl spaces. That night, after a long walk under a sky that had room for all the cold you could pour into it, I made soup, rinsed the bowl, turned every light off but one, and sat in the chair facing the fire until my eyes went heavy. The creak came then. Not a thump this time. A step. The second stair answering the first, slow enough that I could decide whether to stand. Someone testing their weight. That's what it sounded like. Someone careful, someone who knew which boards would speak and which would keep a secret. The steps stopped above the door. The latch didn't lift. Something in the silence opened up between us and held. When the sound went back up, it did it in reverse. As deliberate as a hand laying a card face down on a table. I didn't sleep after that. I leaned into the dark and listened to the tiny shifts houses make when they're adjusting to the lives inside them and tried not to be the only life present. I called the host in the morning and left a message that was mostly about the heater, which I pretended was acting funny so I'd have a reason to ask if anyone else had access to the house. He texted back, "All yours. I'm out on a run. Attic sticks in winter, keep it latched, mice get in. That was the kind of practical answer I wanted. And for an hour it returned my shoulders to their proper place. I worked at the little kitchen table with my laptop, watched two sparrows fight over nothing, and told myself I could stay. But when I got up for coffee, I saw faint scuffs on the top stair, two parallel arcs in the dust as if something had been nudged side to side, the kind of mark a chair leg makes when you walk it an inch along a rough floor. The latch was still down. My hand hung over it, wondering if it would be more foolish to check or to leave it alone. I left it alone. The note had said, "Keep it closed." I had promised myself the quiet. That night, I set a mug on the top step of the kitchen stairs and a spoon across it, the old trick my grandmother taught me when the dog was young and too clever with door handles. If any door moved, the spoon would fall. I turned off the lamps and let the fire die on its own, lay down on the couch and stared into the seam where ceiling met wall. Snow began somewhere after midnight, a soft hush on the roof, and with it the steps returned, one by one. I waited for the spoon. Nothing fell. The weight stopped over the door. A new sound followed, high and thin, a thread pulled slow through cloth. It took me a second to understand the cold tightening my teeth. Someone, or something, was drawing that thin sound right across the latch, testing the brass with a fingernail or with something like one not lifting, just feeling the seam. The steps went back up again, and the house settled. At dawn, I told myself to stop letting night make me into a child. I took the keys, thumbed the latch, and opened the attic door a hand's width. The smell that came down wasn't rot or animal. It was dry dust and old paper, a smell like a school closet. I put a knee on the bottom step, reached my arm up with my phone light. The beam dragged across rafters and the undersides of shingles and a wide plank floor with a lane of brighter boards where someone had walked for years between the hatch and the far end. Dust lay on everything but that path. At the end of the lane, dead center under the roof peak, sat a small wooden chair, maybe for a child or maybe simply old. It faced me square. The seat shine said it had seen use long after the rest of the attic had quit the world. No boxes, no trunks. Just that chair and that path, and the suggestion that someone liked to sit there and look at the hatch the way I was looking at them looking at it. I closed the door and set the latch. I did not move the chair. I did not tell the host. I packed in the late morning, told myself it was weather, that the roads could turn bad, that I had deadlines, that whatever quiet I'd come for had slid one room over and would not come back. When I carried my bag to the car, I noticed the thin line of melted snow on the roof above the kitchen, a dry stripe where heat must have been escaping. On the porch rail, a quilt that had hung loose the day I arrived was folded tight, corners aligned, as if someone had squared the house before I left. I stood there breathing the kind of cold that cleans out your head and tried to hear normal things. A crow gurgling, a far-off truck on the state road, my own boots shifting. I didn't hear anything in the attic because the house was being kind, or because I was already gone. Back in town, the barista asked me if I'd enjoyed the old place, and I said it was lovely, which is the word we use when a place proves that we're not as alone as we thought, and we don't want to explain why. I left a review that was kind and vague. I didn't mention the chair. I still think about it at odd hours, mostly when the apartment upstairs creaks in the pattern of someone walking from stairwell to kitchen and back again. Sometimes I wake before my alarm and lie still, counting off the seconds so I can say to myself, there's nothing here, the world is safe in its skin. And sometimes when the heat kicks on and the duck grumbles like a river tucked into a wall, I imagine a hand resting on the other side of a latch, not lifting, only checking that it still slides the way it always has. And I wonder who first decided to lock that door from the outside, and whether they did it to keep something in or to keep someone else from going up to take that chair and sit in the place the house had saved. Story 2, The Lantern Beyond the Tree Line. I booked the place for the silence, the kind that makes your own breathing sound too loud. The listing said isolated, which for some people is a warning and for me was a promise. The road up was mostly switchbacks and frost heave. A 2-lane that tried to pretend it wasn't a single track when it bent around the ridge. The cabins sat back from the gravel, tucked in a bowl of hemlock and laurel where the wind slowed down to listen. It was cleaner than I expected. Fresh sheets, a mason jar of coffee grounds, a hand-lettered note that said to lock the bear latch on the trash. I made soup from a can and watched the light go out of the trees like someone was dimming the world from the edges in. There's a kind of hush the mountains keep for themselves once the sun leaves the ridges. No engines, no voices carrying, just the creak somewhere under wet leaves and the hammer-faint tick of a stove cooling. I slept hard the first night, the way you do when you trust the roof over you and don't know yet what the dark around that roof holds. The second night, after another bowl of soup because I'd misjudged how far the next store would be. I stood on the back deck and let the cold soak up through my socks to remind me where I was. The backyard wasn't a yard so much as an idea of 2 flat steps of ground before the forest rose, a line where human habit gave up and the land resumed. That's when I saw the glow. It wasn't a campfire. I grew up around campfires and know how they flicker and throw shadows in a way that gives them away. This was a steady orange eye, low to the ground and barely moving. Deep between the trees just past the line where the deck light stops helping. I turned the porch light off and the glow seemed to drift, not closer exactly, but awake, as if it registered that the dark was different now and it could test a little. I watched it until my eyes hurt. The cold is the only reason I went back inside. When I checked again before bed, there was nothing but the thicket and the impression you get when you've stared too long and every shadow promises it's a person. In the morning there were boot prints on the deck boards, wet, not muddy. Size hard to guess because the boards had swelled and the water had spidered across the grain, but they led from the steps up to the back door and then back toward the steps again, as if someone had walked up, paused, and decided against the courtesy of a knock. The handle felt cold in a way that set the nerves in my hand on edge. I texted the host because that's the new prayer. Send a message and wait for the reply to make your fear sound silly. He wrote back with a smiley face and, "No one else booked. You're the only one on the property. Locals do walk past sometimes. Hunters, don't worry." He added a note about keeping the deck light off after 10, park rules, and a line about mountain lions that read like a joke but wasn't funny. I told myself the prints could have been from the first day. Maybe the cleaner came late. The boards were still damp in the shade. I decided I'd start locking the back door with the deadbolt. It made an agreeable thunk, the sound of a thing deciding to be a wall. That evening, clouds settled low enough to be tasted. The trees hid their faces, and the fog pressed itself against the windows like breath on glass. I ate in front of the little TV with a DVD somebody had left. The kind of low-budget drama where you can hear the paper in the script when they talk. I told myself to stop checking the window and then checked it anyway because the body likes its rituals. The glow was back. Same place. Same steady orange. Like someone cupped a lantern at knee height and kept their hands still. This time, after 10 minutes of it not doing anything except proving it existed, I went to the kitchen and picked up the heavy flashlight the host had left by the door. My plan was to step out on the deck and swing a bright cone over the trees and make a show of it. "Hey there, I see you. We're all civilized here." But when I opened the door and the cold air slid down my shirt, the glow eased farther into the trees by a foot, maybe 2, as if to say it would be the one to choose the distance between us. I put the flashlight back on the hook and locked the door. I slept with the radio low, some AM station out of somewhere else. Voices fading in and out like a foghorn, and every time a car had raised its pitch, my heart ran ahead of it. On the 3rd morning, I made myself walk the tree line. There were deer tracks, the 2-finger print of a raccoon, and boot treads that didn't match mine. The prints kept to the narrow stretches of exposed red clay where the leaves couldn't hide them, and then they disappeared into the laurel where the ground stayed soft even under the canopy because the creek fed it underground. It could have been anyone, a neighbor I hadn't met, a trespasser from the old logging road, a kid with more nerve than sense. I told myself a story about a hiker who got turned around and saw the light from the cabin and decided a deck was a safe place to collect his thoughts. Those are the stories you offer yourself, and they work right up until you try to sleep inside them. That night, the glow was closer, not on the deck, but nearer than the night before. Like it had learned a route between routes, and knew how much time it would take to back out if I moved toward it. I turned the inside lights off and let the house go dark, then sat on the floor under the window and watched with just my eyes showing over the sill, childish and ashamed and glad to be unseen. A moth bounced against the glass. The radio whispered nothing. Somewhere down the ridge, a dog barked like it had a right to an answer. The glow drifted left, right, stopped. And then, in that way things do when you're certain you're controlling the situation, it disappeared and reappeared a yard closer. I couldn't figure out how it did that without noise. Even the careful have to break a twig sometimes. Then I remembered the moss I'd seen over the roots earlier, thick and damp and forgiving. When I finally made myself stand, the glow sank, not all the way to the ground, just lower, as if the hand holding it changed positions or set it on a stump. I went into the bedroom and pulled the shade down and then pulled it up again, because the idea of not knowing seemed worse than the idea of seeing. The glow stood just under the window now, the glass between us, a thin idea. For a second I thought I saw the outline of a shoulder catch the light, or the suggestion of breath making lint move on the other side of the screen. And then the house shifted, some natural settling that felt like a held note, and the glow leaned in enough to brighten the plaster as if it was sunrise. I pressed my palm to the glass, because I wanted something of mine to meet something of the night halfway, and the cold climbed bone to bone until it felt like it could make an argument in my elbow. I didn't go out. That's the truth that matters. I stood there, the way we do when we're deciding which version of ourselves we're going to be, and chose the one that keeps breathing tomorrow. The glow stayed. It didn't knock. It didn't lift higher or press against the screen. It just let me know where it was until the night, bored or merciful, made a new choice for it. I woke an hour before dawn, stiff from standing, the room faintly orange not from any light outside, but from the memory of it. When I stepped onto the deck, the boards were wet again, the same size-ambiguous prints in and out, and a matchstick burned to a black nub. Lay in the groove between two planks like a message I didn't know how to read. I left that afternoon. On the drive down, I saw a man in an army jacket at the mouth of an old road, hands in his pockets, looking not at me, but into the trees like he was counting. Maybe he had a lantern in his truck. Maybe he had a reason to need to be near someone else's window in the cold. I could make a life out of the maybes. Back home, sometimes when the refrigerator motor cuts in with that soft sigh it makes, I feel again the way the glass gave my heat back to me and nothing else. I've tried to think of a word for the kind of seeing that isn't about eyes, when you recognize the shape of a person by the way their intention feels on your skin, but there isn't one I can find that doesn't sound dramatic, so I keep it small. I check the deadbolts. I sweep my hand over the bedroom shades before I sleep, and if the neighbor's porch light throws a low stripe over my wall, I leave it where it falls and let the room hold it. It's easier, most nights, to pretend that somewhere a stranger's job is to carry the dark safely through to morning, and they picked my window for a minute because I looked like I could use the company. And on the nights that don't let me pretend, I stand still and breathe and try not to imagine the orange glow finding me again, because if you look long enough into a tree line, the tree line learns your face and will eventually say your name back. Story 3. The Locked Room with No Listing Photo. The cabin looked like a picture you'd keep on a bulletin board to remind yourself what quiet is supposed to look like. Raw pine walls, braided rugs, a view of laurel and hemlock pressed up against the glass. I carried my bag inside and did that slow walk through you do, not to admire things so much as to teach your nerves where the corners are. Everything matched the photos, down to the chipped blue kettle and the faded quilt with hand-stitched stars. Everything except the door in the living room. In the listing, the camera always seemed to angle just shy of that corner, as if the photographer had a favorite side of the room. Up close, the door was nothing special. White paint, old knob, no sign or padlock. Just a piece of the wall that had decided to be useful. I put my hand on the knob and felt a little tremor run into my palm. A hum, steady and faint. Like a far-off generator or a refrigerator down the hall in a hospital. I told myself it was a utility closet and turned the knob. It moved easy, metal on metal, but the door itself gave only an inch and then met something that didn't want to move. Not a deadbolt, more like a shoulder on the other side. I put my eye to the narrow seam and saw only dark. Cold air leaked through, the kind that smells like old paper and metal shavings. Above the frame, a small return vent had been cut into the wall and painted over. A strip of dust clung to the slats, and I could see where fingers, whose, I didn't want to guess, had brushed through it recently. Clean rakes in the grey. I let the door close and told myself it was better to meet a house's secrets on your own schedule. Night fell thick and early the way it does when the ridge leans in close, and the cabin settled into that deep quiet that lets ordinary sounds grow bones. The hum behind the door became part of the room, a low note the floor knew how to carry. I lay on the couch with a book I wasn't reading and let the stove tick itself cool. Sometime after midnight I woke without knowing why and heard it, breathing from behind the door, slow, measured, not in time with mine. It wasn't the wind, which makes its own talk in old walls. This had the softness of a throat and the little catch at the end of an exhale you hear when someone's fallen asleep in a chair. I held my breath without meaning to, and the breathing kept on. When I couldn't stand it, I coughed on purpose, and the sound on the other side paused, counting me, maybe, and then resumed, a touch faster, as if embarrassed. In the morning I looked for rational things. I found the breaker panel by the back door and labelled switches for well, heat, fridge. I flipped well off and on and stood by the door listening. The hum was separate, undisturbed. I took the flashlight from the shelf and angled it through the inch the door would give me. The beam found rough wood 2 feet beyond, the unfinished back of something tall, and the edge of a plastic bin stacked against it. The light chased dust motes that lifted like minnows and slid over the floor toward the vent. Something heavy had been dragged across those boards recently. 2 pale arcs showed where it had walked. I texted the host a polite version of a question I didn't want to ask. He replied that the closet held owner storage, that everything was safe and sound, and I should please keep it closed so the heat runs right. The ... of the typing indicator flashed and died twice, as if he had more he might have said, and then thought better of it. By the second night, the hum had taken on a texture, a suggestion of voice braided into it so lightly that when I leaned in, I wasn't sure whether I was hearing words or the shape that words leave behind. Not radio. There was no sweep or static, no drift through stations. Just a tone that rose and fell close to a whisper. I sat with my back to the opposite wall and counted the breaths between my breaths. When I let mine out, the other lengthened, as if we were trying to avoid overlapping in a small space. The air at the seam felt almost damp. Every once in a while, something tapped along the baseboard inside, very soft, like a ring brushing wood when a hand shifts. Sometime past 3, I couldn't keep from testing the door again. The knob turned, the inch opened. Cold threaded over my fingers. I whispered, "Hello," not because I wanted an answer, but because people say threads out loud when they think a stranger might be in the next room. The breathing stilled. The hum leaned brighter, then dimmed, as if someone had shifted a machine from their lap to the floor, or cupped a hand around its intake. Maybe that's all it was, I told myself. A concentrator. An old compressor. Something medical the owner kept tucked away and didn't want renters messing with. That would have been a kindness, but kindness usually has a sign on it. There was no sign. I checked out a day early. I washed the mugs, folded the quilt to its old crease, and left the key where the welcome note asked. On the drive down the mountain, I kept the radio off and listened to my own breath until the muscles in my chest ached from paying attention. The phone buzzed at the first wide spot with service. The host's message sat on the screen like it had been waiting for me to stop moving. "You didn't open the door, did you?" I watched the typing bubble appear and disappear twice more and pocketed the phone without answering. It's been a week, and sometimes at night I hear the steady hum of the refrigerator in my apartment slip sideways into something that sounds too much like a person keeping time with me. I put my hand on the hall closet knob and turn it just enough to feel the latch click, then stop before it yields. Not because there's anything behind it, but because I have learned that leaving certain doors closed is a way of being polite to whatever has decided to stay on the other side. Story 4, The Cabin with the 2 guest books. The cabin had the kind of quiet you can hear before you get to the door. A hush pooled beneath the trees like water where the ridge breaks the wind. I set my bag down and did the routine I always do in a new place. Walk the rooms, touch the light switches, see which windows stick and which don't. The kitchen smelled like pine cleaner and old coffee. On the table sat the usual guest book, a fat spiral with cheerful covers. I flipped through while the kettle struggled toward a boil, couples thanking the host, hikers listing overlooks, a note about a fox that sat on the driveway and watched someone eat an apple. Every few pages there were hearts drawn around initials, and once a maple leaf pressed between paper towels like the cabin was a scrapbook. When the kettle clicked off, I put the book down and opened the silverware drawer hunting for a teaspoon. It stuck halfway, then gave suddenly, and something thumped the back of the drawer from inside the cabinet. I swore under my breath and reached in. Behind the cutlery tray was a second notebook, smaller, with a plain brown cover spotted by old grease. It shouldn't have felt different when I touched it, but it did, as if someone had warmed the cover with their hands an hour before. The handwriting inside was tight and shaky, lines pressed hard so you could feel the grooves on the back of each page. No names, no dates beyond the day of the week and a time. Each entry was a number with a note. 1:47 a.m., scratching in walls by stove. 3:15, someone breathing on porch. Forwards go to, 2 taps against window near sink. The most recent line was from 2 days earlier. 5 to go 3, bedroom window slid open, still dark outside. I stood in the middle of the kitchen and listened to the refrigerator hum, then turned slowly toward the hall to the bedroom and looked at the thin roller shade like that would tell me anything. The note on the counter from the host said the same thing all these notes say: enjoy. Text if you need anything, please don't feed the bears. But the last line made me pause. Kindly return books to table before checkout. Books, plural. Somehow that sentence didn't register as strange until after I'd seen the little brown one. The first night passed in the ordinary way. Too much light the first hour because I was convinced of pressures at the glass. Then a quick drop into heavy sleep once my mind ran out of ways to explain the world. I woke on my back in the dark to the faintest drag of sound near the stove. At first I thought it was the wind teasing a branch along the siding, a dry brush in and out of the house's own breath. Then it settled into a pattern, a cautious scrabble, a pause, a single scrape like a fingernail on drywall, then silence long enough to make you count. I lay there with the blanket pulled to my chin like a child and checked the clock. 1:47 burned in green at me. I don't like stories that make big deals of numbers like something mystic is keeping time. I told myself it would feel less pointed if I looked again in 5 minutes. But every time I closed my eyes, the sound returned to exactly where I'd left it, like a record I hadn't lifted the needle from. By 3:15, the cabin had a different quiet, the kind that strains because it's holding something back. I heard it on the porch first, the kind of breathing you learn to hear when you camp. Slow, purposeful. Not a creature that has to work to pull air, but a person who can decide to take less of it if they want. I didn't move. The boards outside ticked in slow succession, the way they do when weight adjusts and the frost surrenders. I wanted to believe it was a deer blowing, but deer snort with authority and go when they decide to go. This stayed. When it finally did fade, it wasn't the way animals leave. It was the breathing of a person who steps off a porch because they remembered something else they had to do. In the clean pale of morning, I looked for sense. I found the tracks in the frost, 2 partial prints on the top step of the porch, 2 smeared to be sure of size, then nothing where the sun had reached first. The window by the sink had grit in the track, a single pin oak leaf stuck to the far end as if something had been shoved and the leaf rode it and then stayed. I told myself it was from the last storm. I told myself a lot of things while I drank the coffee that tasted faintly of metal. Then I took the brown book back out and ran my fingers over the page with the 503 entry. The writing had the tremor of a hand trying to be legible through fear. When I flipped back further, I saw the same time surface again and again. Different months, different inks. A rhythm to the nights here that people had tried to document the way you write down what medicine you took and when. So if things go bad later, someone can make sense of your choices. That evening, I wrote my own line on a blank page, feeling half like a thief and half like somebody signing a ledger for a tool they needed to borrow. 1:47, scratching by stove. I let the pencil rest in the groove of the spiral because you leave things for the next person when you're decent. I set small warnings, a mug balanced on the inside doorknob of the bedroom, a thin strip of painter's tape over the window track, not because I expected those things to stop anything, but because I needed to feel that I'd done one practical thing a person could do. I stayed up longer than was good for me, eyes on the window shade, ears straining toward the porch, until the kind of tired that wins out over fear caught me sideways. The mug fell sometime before 3, the small clatter of ceramic against wood that made my heart punch once hard in my chest. It hadn't fallen far, just rattled where the door trembled under a change of air. I sat up and listened to the sound of someone drawing breath on the other side of thin pine, a slow in and a slow out, the threshold translating it into a pulse at my feet. "You okay out there?" I said, because the thing you're afraid of becomes a person when you put words into the dark. The breathing paused in surprise, then started again, a tiny bit farther away, as if I had embarrassed them. Sometime after 4, the house pressed in tight around me the way mornings do when the cold has settled in the corners and you are waiting for something outside to decide on you. I watched the tape on the window track like a doctor watching a monitor. At 5:03, a sound like the first inch of a drawer moving threaded into the quiet, and the tape parted with a soft complaint. Cold draft touched my face and filled my mouth with the taste of wet iron, the way stream banks have after rain. The shade moved a fraction without rising, as if the window had bumped it and then stopped. I was not brave. I didn't lunge for it, or rip the shade, or throw the lamp. I lay there and breathed as silently as I could, and that was when I heard it. Pages turning in the kitchen. Slow, deliberate. The soft brush of paper against paper like someone refusing to rush through another person's words. I could picture exactly where the brown book sat, and the sound of it moving made the hair along my arms lift in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I told myself a draft could do that. If the front door doesn't seal, a push of wind through a cabin can slide a spiral just enough to make noise. If the fridge motor kicks on or off, you get a pulse along the walls. I told myself these things while each page turned carefully, one and then another, with a patience that felt like attention. I counted 3 turns, then silence. When I finally stood, the window sat closed again on the parted tape. My hand settled onto the sill and came away damp. In the kitchen, the brown book lay open to the page where I'd written my one line, and the pencil had rolled from the groove onto the table as if it had been lifted and set down without care for where it might go next. There was no new writing, nothing dramatic to make it a story, just the quiet and the awareness of my own breath flattening itself. I left a day early. I washed the cup that had rattled against the door and returned it to the shelf with the other blues, then wrote in the cheerful guest book the kind of thank you that keeps the world from asking follow-up questions. I put the brown book back in the drawer behind the cutlery, though the note had asked for books on the table. I couldn't make myself leave it where it looked like it belonged. On the drive down the mountain, my phone buzzed where I finally had service. The host's message was short. Hope your stay was peaceful. Please leave both notebooks out next time. Cleaner will file them. I watched the typing bubble rise and fall and didn't answer. At home, there are no porches to breathe on, no tracks to read in frost. But I still wake sometimes just before 5 with the taste of cold on my tongue, and the sense that someone in the next room has turned a page gently so as not to wake me, and I lie there praying it's only me, remembering how paper sounds. Story 5. The host who never stopped watching. The listing said the host lived nearby, and in the mountains that can mean a mile by road and 100 yards by crow. So I didn't think much of it when the check-in envelope was taped to the door, and the key was warm from where the sun had laid on it. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, just past where the gravel surrendered to weeds, and the trees knit themselves back together on 3 sides like a mouth closing. Inside, pine walls, a faint smell of Murphy oil, a welcome note in tidy block letters that ended with a line I almost missed. If you need anything, I'll be around. The first day passed in that way quiet places do, one small job at a time. Sweep out the grit by the door, fill the kettle, learn the lamp switches, decide a chair is yours. I liked how the clearing caught the last light like a bowl. I liked how the radio on the counter, an old one with a cracked dial, scrubbed in and out of AM voices from other valleys. By the second night, the cold had sharpened enough to fleece the grass. I was on the couch with a book I wasn't reading when I noticed what I'd taken for a tree stump across the clearing wasn't where I remembered it. The shape seemed taller, then the head tilted, just the angle of it. and my stomach went loose the way it does right before a fall. Whoever it was stood very still, long enough that the night swallowed the certainty I'd seen them move. I went to the door and pretended to check the latch, because sometimes pretending makes you feel like the world is arranged. I did not open it. The figure stayed where the clearing lifts, not advancing, not hiding, the way deer will if they're trying to decide if you're the kind of danger they know. In the morning, the shape was gone and the clearing was only a clearing again. Grass bent where the frost had burned, and a low line of fog walking the tree line until the sun taught it manners. Outside the front door, in the grey powder on the stoop, were footprints that weren't mine. Not straight on, not to and from, but pacing in a half circle, heel to toe, like someone had been listening with their feet. I told myself it could be anyone. Someone lost from the old logging road, a neighbour checking the property line. But the prints kept choosing the same sweep of arc where a person would stand to hear through wood. I texted the host, a polite version of, "Is anyone else around?" He wrote back fast, "Just me." "Cell reception's spotty. Wave if you need something." No smiley, no apology. At dusk, the clearing got its bowl of light again, and the wind braided the hemlocks in a way that sounds like speech if you let it. I left the porch light off and watched from behind the curtain because fear likes curtains. Nothing came. The book put me to sleep on the couch. Sometime past midnight, a faint static began to tick through the wall behind my head. Not the radio on the counter. This was closer, thinner. The little salt and pepper noise of a walkie-talkie keyed without anyone talking. I held still and listened as it rose and fell with my movements, louder when I sat up, quieter when I lay down, like someone had placed a receiver on the other side of the wall and was riding the squelch to hear me breathe. By the last night, I had convinced myself of a dozen small reasons to stay and one large reason to leave early. It's hard to list what the large reason is to anyone who wasn't there. It was in the way the clearing felt occupied even when it was empty, in the way the radio voices ducked under a hush at the exact moments when the floor checked my weight. I washed the mug I'd been using and folded the wool throw like a guest with good manners, and told myself I'd pack in the morning. The static started around 1, soft as a moth, a little hiss that thickened each time I crossed the room, answering the turns of my shoulders. I stood very still and then took 2 quick steps, and the hiss jumped like a pulse. Whoever had their thumb on the talk button didn't press it to speak. They pressed it to count me. I couldn't make myself open the door. In the dark glass I saw my own outline and, beyond it, the suggestion of a vertical shape across the clearing that should have been a stump. At first light, I carried my bag to the car. Frost showed me fresh prints again. A neat arc outside the door, as if the same person had traced the same half-circle to listen through pine. I shut the trunk softly because it felt like the kind of morning that punishes loudness. When I rolled down the drive and the trees widened enough to give me a slice of the clearing in the rear view, I saw him, a man at the far edge, hands in his pockets, shoulders forward like he was leaning into a wind only he could feel. He didn't wave. He didn't move. The walkie hissed once from somewhere inside the cabin, small and satisfied, and then the road bent and took the view away. Back home, my apartment walls are thin, and sometimes, when the neighbor's TV goes to snow between channels, I lie very still and try not to measure my breathing against it, because I know what it feels like now to live inside someone else's idea of quiet, and it has nothing to do with sound at all. Story 6. The River Sound in the Walls. I picked the cabin because the map showed nothing blue anywhere near it. No creeks, no ponds, just a ridge like a knuckle under thin skin and a gravel drive that ended where the hemlocks began. It was the sort of quiet I pay for. Raw boards. A wood stove that still smelled faintly of last winter, a kitchen window that admitted the kind of evening light that makes you forgive your own decisions. The first night I cracked the window for cold and fell asleep on the couch with the book on my chest. Sometime after midnight I woke to water. Not a drip, not a pipe knocking, but the soft, confident hush of a river finding its speed. It came from the walls. I sat up and listened to the lap build into a run and then relax again without stopping, as if the house had laid itself along a bank I couldn't see. I turned every faucet to prove something and then turned them off again to prove something else. The toilet tank was calm, the well pump didn't kick, and still the sound flowed, under, behind, inside. When I pressed my ear to the paneling the way a child listens for the ocean in a shell, the cold jumped my temple, and beneath the water I heard something move. It wasn't an animal sound. It was the kind of slow, deliberate brush a hand makes along stone when the current takes it and the fingers are learning a surface. I told myself it was plumbing, because people like me don't believe in anything but the things we already know how to fix, and then I lay awake until dawn as the river kept its own hour. In daylight, the place refused to share my problem. The boards were warm, the corners dry, the air clean the way it gets after a frost has told the mold to mind itself. I walked the perimeter and saw no downspout, no footing drain, just long roots like ropes and a patch of skunk cabbage far from any sane waterline. An old nail head on the south wall had bled rust down the siding in a thin tear. When I stepped inside, the hush rose like a crowd whose seats you'd crept past. I made coffee, and the smell of metal in it reminded me of a creek you aren't supposed to drink from. I told myself about underflow, about the way a ridge can hold a seam of water deep enough to talk if you bothered to listen. I didn't press my ear to the wall again. The second night, the house did that thing old houses do, making you earn the dark by presenting you with warnings disguised as manners. The water gathered itself until the quiet strained around it. I stood in the hallway and felt cool come off the paneling like breath. When I lowered my head to the seam where two boards met, the sound was close enough that my jawbone carried it. Something passed beneath it again, that slow brush, like a palm testing rock for purchase, then withdrew, then returned a foot farther along, as if it had learned a path and wanted me to know it knew. I slept under the quilt with my socks on, and woke to them cold and heavy, not from sweat, but from being near a thing that wouldn't share its temperature. By the third night, the hush had become a voice that didn't bother with words. It came on like weather. The walls themselves felt damp, a cool that pushed through cloth and waited in the hollows near elbow and throat. I set my hand flat and left it there until the ache in the tendons taught me humility. The river inside the wood rose. It wasn't anger, but it was intent. Loose paper on the table trembled, not from draft, but from that tiny insistence a big sound has when it's got nowhere to go. I closed every window, and still the air tasted of iron and leaf rot. The tannic tongue of water that's gone underground and decided it prefers it there. Somewhere in the run, I heard a strike like stone on stone, followed by that brushing, slower now, as if knuckles learned they might bleed. In the morning, my feet printed the floor with wet like I'd come in from a rain that hadn't happened. The wood darkened under each step and then slowly released me. There was no damp on the rug, no drips from the ceiling, just the boards agreeing I'd been here in the way riverbanks hold your boot for an extra beat, and then let it go. I packed because I'm not the kind of person who brings solutions, only stories, and the cabin felt like a thing that wanted to keep its own. When I carried the bag to the car, the air was bright and ordinary, the kind that makes you laugh at yourself. I put my palm one last time to the outside wall and felt nothing but sun-warmed pine. Back home, the radiators hissed in the familiar way that belongs to cities and not to hollers. But 2 nights later, I woke to the susurrus running along the baseboards, soft and steady, and for a long minute I waited for it to climb. I lay still and counted to see if it kept its own measure or took mine, and when I couldn't tell, I went to the kitchen and stood with my ear against the cool of the refrigerator, needing the ridiculous comfort of a human machine. In the hum, I could almost hear a brush of fingers along stone, or maybe I only wanted to name what I'd left. Somewhere beneath concrete and pipe and every story we tell ourselves about where water belongs, something is moving with patience. I wash my cups slower now. I keep a towel near the bed. In the mornings when the light is thin, the floor feels cool enough to warn me that the house knows a river better than I do, and will let it pass through, whether I listen or not. Story 7. The Guest Before Me. Never left, the host's message was polite in that mountain way. Short, careful, a little formal. Apologies if you find a few personal items, it said. Last guest left in a hurry. I took it to mean someone forgot a toothbrush. Inside the cabin, the light had that golden late afternoon patience you only get when the ridge steals the sun early. I set my bag down and did my slow inspection. Stove, shutters, well switch, the way floorboards talk under your weight. On the daybed by the window, somebody had stacked things that didn't belong to me. A pair of boots with a dried ribbon of mud up one side like they'd walked a creek edge. A flannel shirt folded into a square that didn't match the tone of any hanger in the closet. A phone charger still plugged in with the cord draped neat like a tail. They were clean enough to have been cared for, dirty enough to have had work in them. I moved the shirt to the back of a chair because it felt like setting a plate at a table, and I didn't want to do that yet. The loft above the living room was just a dark square with a slatted rail and a pull chain that hung too high to grab without a chair. The listing hadn't mentioned a loft. The host binder on the counter had instructions for the wood stove and a note about bears, but nothing about upstairs. The first night settled without incident. The stove ticked as it cooled. The radio caught some low AM talk and lost it. The hemlocks made the old language hush they make when wind comes from the west. I woke when the house did. Not to any single sound, but the way a room lets you know it has a second conversation going. After a few minutes, it found a shape. Footsteps across the loft. Not scurry, not skitter, but weight distributed with the patience of someone thinking. Back and forth. 4 steps. Turn. The slight lag of a heel finding the board that always gives away the turn, then back again. I sat up and listened to the rhythm until it welded itself to my heart. "Hello?" I said, because you turn noises into people on purpose when that gives you rules. The steps stopped. The quiet hung its shoulders low. Then, the steps started again. Slower, like someone had chosen not to answer and wanted me to know they'd chosen. In the morning, the boots sat at the foot of the bed I'd moved them away from. Toes pointing in like someone lined them up while they stood there. The flannel, which I draped across the chair, had slid across the seat, so one sleeve hung toward the floor. I checked my phone for a message that would turn it all into a mix-up and found only a weather alert about frost. I texted the host. "All good. Question. Loft usable?" The reply came fast. "Loft is locked. Been months. Please don't try to open." I stood under the hatch and stared up at that rail. The chain swayed a fraction, maybe because houses breathe, maybe because I had made the air feel like it had a job. I got a chair anyway because I hate being told not to learn a thing. The hatch lip was painted shut along one edge, but there was a cold seam I could feel with my fingers. I didn't pull. That evening, I set 2 small tests, not because I thought they'd stop anything, but because doing nothing makes fear loud. I dusted flour in a shallow crescent on the floor between the daybed and the bedroom door, and balanced a spoon across the latch because my grandmother had a dog that knew handles. The night went long. The footsteps started later, or I heard them sooner. The back and forth was slower now, like someone who's measuring their breaths against yours. When I shifted on the mattress, the pacing paused. When I held still, it resumed. I tried the radio for the noise of strangers and got nothing but static, which is just a different counting. Somewhere near 2, a cold draft moved through the room with the kind of intention that follows a person. The spoon clicked once against the latch. I waited, air tight in my chest. Nothing opened. The footsteps went back to their lane above me, and I could feel the weight in my teeth. The boards telling me what a person wears when they walk too long in the same boots. Dawn made the flour honest. A single line ran across the crescent, a soft scuff from the shelf to the bed, too shallow for tread but too straight for air. I knelt to clean it up, and found a hair snagged at the edge, short, dark, not mine. I put it on the counter and then moved it to the trash, and then took it back out and dropped it into the sink because I couldn't decide what it was proof of. The boots waited polite, as if I'd forgotten to put them back on the shelf. I packed without admitting I was packing, folding and pulling and setting aside until leaving looked like an errand. When I stepped out to load the car, Frost made a quiet show of what had been. Prints on the porch where someone had stood and shifted their weight in a narrow arc, heel to toe, the way you do when you listen with your whole body. The host called as I hit a pocket of service, and the ridge gave me a line of sky. "Everything all right?" he asked, as if a certain kind of guest needs reminding how to answer. "Thought I heard footsteps," I said, keeping my voice shaped like a joke. A pause then. "Loft's locked. No one up there. Cleaner's been out of town." A second pause. Longer. "Did you move those boots?" he asked. The question landed in my ear the way a hand lands on a table when someone needs it to be heard. I said I'd put them back where I found them. "Good," he said softly, as if I'd done something kind for someone we both knew and weren't going to name. I checked my mirror while the road bent and the trees parted. For a breath, before the curve took it, I saw the dark square of the loft window that I knew didn't exist, only the idea of it laid behind the siding, and in that idea a patient shape crossing and turning, keeping its hour. At home, my ceilings don't have second floors, but some nights I hear neighbors' footsteps and cannot tell which of us is the one who hasn't left. I keep my shoes under the bed now, paired and waiting, because it feels like good manners to set a place. Story 8. The Mirror That Showed. Last week, the bathroom in that cabin had a mirror with a cloudy belly, a fogged oval where the silver on the back had aged like a bruise. Everything else about the place was tidy in the way of rentals that I love just enough. Folded quilts, mugs with hairline cracks, a note about bears and how the trash latch worked. The mirror was the only thing that felt older than the arrangement. First night, I brushed my teeth and leaned in to see if the chip on my front tooth had gone any worse, and that's when I realized the cloud wasn't reflecting me. It was reflecting the same room, same yellowed light, same chute of cork by the tub, but with someone else moving inside it. A man in a heavy coat, dripping, little beads on the cuffs like he'd stood under a gutter too long. He paced slow, short passes like he'd made that distance into a habit. He wiped his hands on a towel that wasn't on my rack, then stood with his head cocked, listening to a sound I couldn't hear. I backed up and caught my own face at the edges of the glass, my features bending around the cloudy center, which kept its other scene like a held breath. When I stepped out and leaned back in to check again, the mirror only gave me myself, tired and foolish over a trick of light. Morning reset the world. The ridge drank the sun early and left the cabin in a bowl of quiet that would embarrass a person for wanting more of it. I walked the gravelled loop and saw no creek, no pond, nothing to explain a man who looked wrung out. The hose binder had receipts tucked in from the hardware store, drain snake, silicone, mirror adhesive. A line was underlined. Mirror temperamental. Don't scrub. I made a note to myself not to pick at old things. That evening, the cold settled heavy. The mirror kept its cloud no matter how long the room stayed warm. I turned the shower on hot until the corners sweated and the glass lost its memory for a while, and I felt silly. When I wiped the steam away with my forearm, the oval sharpened again, and there he was, as if I had cleared a window for him. Not pacing this time. He sat on the edge of the tub in the reflected room. Head in his hands, coat dark with wet. I could smell wool somehow, that damp animal mineral, even though the only smell in my bathroom was cheap soap and hot dust off the bulb. I lifted my hand and he didn't. I said, "Hey," as if to a neighbour I didn't know well enough to bother, and a second later the light in the reflection flickered in a way my light didn't. When I killed the switch to match it, the glass turned to a blank, starless thing. And I stood in the dark hearing only the slow drip of water settling in pipes that shouldn't have been working. I slept badly and dreamed the mirror loud, like a mouth under a door. A little before dawn, I woke to a chill I hadn't earned, the kind that sits in the corners first and then chooses you. The house was quiet. No radio, no wind riding the hemlocks. I went to the bathroom like a kid checking under a bed, and there was only me, bag-eyed. A line down my cheek where the pillow had written its one sentence. I laughed some and it bit like a cough. The day spent itself without answer. I checked the siding outside the bathroom and found new cork old enough to have caught dust, nothing more. The cabin didn't have a crawl space. It had a low skirt of lattice where leaves had drifted and decided to be dirt. At supper I turned my chair so I could see the bathroom door because people do that when they'd like to pretend they aren't waiting. On the last night, I brushed my teeth in the kitchen sink to avoid the thing I was going to do anyway. I told myself it was the kind of superstition you starve by not feeding. When it was late enough that the silence seemed to be holding off a tide, I went in. The cloud in the glass had never looked so neat, its oval edge crisp as a coin. He stood right where I had to stand to face it. We were two people occupying the same small piece of geometry with different weather. His coat glistened. Water crawled down in quick, clear ladders and vanished at the collar like the fabric could drink more than it weighed. He had that look people wear when they try not to scare you. Mouth bent toward nice, eyes wrong with effort. He lifted his chin to line up with mine and leaned the smallest distance forward. I didn't move. There are times you don't move because the body knows the cost of finishing a motion. His breath fogged my side of the glass, not a film from my lungs, not that familiar bloom you make by huffing to draw a smiley with your finger. A bead of damp gathered on my skin and broke and ran down toward my lip and tasted of metal and leaves. I reached up without meaning to and, for a second that will live longer than me, met the cold shape of a mouth that wasn't where it should be. I did not sleep in that house again. I rolled my clothes and jammed them into my bag wrong, and drove while the deer owned the shoulder and the fog owned the low parts of the road. In the rear view, the cabin was a square of patient dark, and the woods had the shoulder posture of something that is not finished with conversation. Back home, my mirror is cheap and flat, and new enough to have no memory. But some mornings it holds a soft oval of cloud no shower would earn, centered not where my face is but where his had been. And I shave around it with a care that would look like reverence if anybody watched. I leave the bathroom door half open now to break the geometry and convince myself of angles. It feels like good manners to speak before I lean in. Sometimes I say nothing and stand very still, as if my silence might be the one decent thing left to offer a man who is still trying to cross a room that looks exactly like mine.